My father sat across from me at dinner every single night for 3 years and never once noticed that my plate was completely empty because my own mother made absolutely sure of it. The auditorium lights were too bright and the floor was tilting even though I knew it wasn't. I was walking toward a podium in a green dress that used to fit me at Christmas and now hung off my shoulders like a garment on a wire hanger. 300 people were watching. My legs felt like they belonged to someone else, someone borrowed, someone I was operating from a distance. And this year's Ashcombe Youth Excellence Award goes to Reagan Brennan, the principal said, and the room clapped, and I smiled the way I'd practiced smiling, teeth showing, eyes crinkled, a mask I'd worn so long it had started to feel like skin. I made it 4 steps up the riser before my knees folded. Someone gasped, then several someones. Then the sound became a wave, rolling backward through the rows of parents in metal folding chairs. Reagan, my father's voice cut through all of it, sharp and cracked in a way I had never heard from him. He was moving before I hit the ground, knocking over a chair, and for the first time in 3 years, I watched him actually look at me, not through me, not past me to whatever he needed to say next, at me. My mother reached me first anyway. She always did. She dropped to her knees beside me on the gym floor with a granola bar already in her hand, unwrapped, held out like evidence, like a prop she'd rehearsed pulling from her pocket 100 times in the mirror. "Eat something, baby. Please, you have to eat," she said, loud enough for the back row, and she tried to press it against my mouth while 300 people watched a mother beg her daughter to live. I looked up at her from the floor. My vision was going soft at the edges, gray creeping in from the corners like a photograph left too long in the sun. But I found her eyes, and I held them, and I said the only thing that had been building in my chest for 3 years. "But Mom," I said, and my voice came out steady, almost peaceful. "You said I'm too fat, remember? Every morning when you weigh me." I watched my father's face come apart, not all at once. In pieces, like a windshield taking a rock at highway speed, cracks spreading outward from a single point of impact before the whole thing gives. The last thing I heard before the gray swallowed everything was my little sister's voice, high and shaking, cutting through the auditorium like she'd been saving the words for years and just ran out of room to hold them anymore. "Mom made me put laxatives in her food," Ren said. "When she did eat, then there was nothing. Just black and quiet, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, no hunger at all. I need to back up. I need you to understand how we got to that gym floor, because it didn't happen in a single night. It happened over 3 years, one small cruelty stacked on top of another, until the pile was so tall nobody standing at the bottom could see what it had become. My name is Reagan Brennan. I was born in Ashcombe, Ohio, a town of about 11,000 people built around a shuttered ball-bearing plant, and a river that floods every April whether anyone asks it to or not. My father, Daniel Brennan, worked as a regional sales manager for an industrial parts distributor, which meant he was gone Monday through Thursday most weeks, and home Friday through Sunday, tired in the specific way that made him grateful for whatever was put in front of him and disinclined to ask questions about it. My mother, Carol Brennan, didn't work outside the house. She ran it instead in the way a warden runs a facility, with schedules and rules and a smile she wore for visitors that never once reached her eyes when the door closed behind them. I was 11 when it started. In the fall of the year, I began 6th grade at Ashcombe Middle School. My sister Ren was 8. We shared a bathroom with a scale my mother kept hidden behind a stack of towels in the linen closet, and every morning at 6:55, while my father was in the shower 2 doors down, running the water long enough to use up the hot tank, my mother would pull me into that bathroom and stand me on it. 65 pounds, she said the first morning I remember clearly, her mouth pulling into a thin line of disappointment. Up 2 pounds since Tuesday. No breakfast, no lunch today either. I was 11 years old and I did not understand yet that what she was describing wasn't concern. It sounded, in that first year, almost like love turned inside out, like a mother trying to protect her daughter from something the daughter couldn't see coming. I believed her when she said my body needed managing. I believed her because she was my mother, and because Ren got waffles with syrup most mornings, and because believing her hurt less than the alternative, which was understanding that my own mother had decided my hunger didn't matter. There had been a specific incident back when I was 9 that I didn't understand as foreshadowing until years later, sitting in a hospital bed trying to map the whole shape of what had been done to me. My mother's older sister, my Aunt Denise, had come to visit for a long weekend in August of that year. Denise was heavier than my mother, comfortable in her body in a way that visibly irritated my mother whenever Denise reached for seconds at dinner. On the second night of the visit, I watched my mother watch Denise eat a piece of garlic bread, watched something curdle behind my mother's eyes, and later that night I heard her on the phone with a friend, voice pitched low. "I will not let that happen to my girls," she said. "I don't care what it takes." At 9 years old, I thought she meant something about health. I filed it away and forgot about it. The way children file away most adult conversations they don't have the tools to understand yet, and it wasn't until years later that the sentence came back to me whole, reframed, its true shape finally visible. There's another piece of that same weekend I didn't understand until much later either. On the last morning of Denise's visit, my mother made a full breakfast, pancakes, bacon, the works, and served everyone a plate except me. When Denise noticed and asked why, my mother said I'd already eaten a bowl of cereal in the kitchen before anyone else was up. I hadn't. I was 9 and confused and hungry, and I said nothing, because some part of me had already learned that contradicting my mother in front of company produced consequences responses that arrived later, in private, when nobody else was around to see them. Denise left that Sunday afternoon with a hug and a promise to visit again soon. It would be almost 5 years before she came back to that house, and by then, everything had already happened. My mother also had a specific relationship with numbers that I didn't recognize as pathology until I was much older. She weighed herself every day, sometimes twice, and kept her own private tally taped inside a kitchen cabinet where she thought no one looked. She'd been thin her whole life, she told people, effortlessly thin, though I found out much later from Denise that this wasn't entirely true, that my mother had spent most of high school in a cycle of restriction and secrecy that nobody in their family had ever properly named or addressed. Denise told me this gently, months after the trial, sitting at my father's kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee. "I'm not saying it excuses what she did to you," she said. "Nothing excuses that. I'm saying she learned it somewhere and she never got help for it, and eventually she stopped being the only one paying the price for it. I've thought about that conversation more than almost any other since the whole thing ended. It doesn't make me feel sympathy for her exactly. It makes the shape of what happened feel less like a mystery and more like a pattern nobody interrupted in time. By the time I turned 13 in the spring, the routine was carved into the architecture of our house as solidly as the load-bearing walls. Scale at 655, whispered number, rationed food for the day, usually 3 celery sticks and a rice cake, sometimes half an apple if I'd lost weight the day before and she wanted to reward the trend. Ren, 2 years younger and blessedly, mercifully invisible to whatever my mother's calculations were tracking, got a full lunch every day. Turkey sandwiches, cookies from the bakery on 5th Street, a juice box in the small carton with the bendy straw. There was a specific afternoon in late September of that first year that I still return to sometimes, turning it over like a stone I keep in my pocket. My mother took Ren and me to the grocery store on 5th Street, the one with the bakery counter where they let kids pick out a free cookie from a jar by the register. Ren picked a sugar cookie the size of her palm and ate it before we'd even finished checking out. My mother told me the jar was for customers who actually need the extra calories, said it lightly, almost as a joke, loud enough for the cashier to hear and laugh along with. I remember standing there in my sneakers on the cold tile floor, 11 years old, understanding for the first time that my hunger wasn't just being rationed at home. It was going to be managed in public too, wherever we went, dressed up as humor so no one would think to intervene. I tried, in that first year, to signal what was happening without saying it outright, because my mother had made clear, in ways both spoken and not, what would happen if I told the truth plainly. Is it normal to feel dizzy when I stand up too fast? I asked my father at dinner one night in October, keeping my voice light, testing the water the way you'd test a frozen pond before putting your full weight on it. My mother laughed before he could answer, a bright, easy sound that filled the space so completely there was no room left for him to worry. "Teenagers are so dramatic," she said, reaching over to squeeze his hand. I was exactly the same at her age. Growth spurts do that. He nodded, satisfied, and speared another piece of chicken off his plate. My plate, across from his, held 4 green beans arranged to look like more than they were. He never once looked down at it long enough to count. I want to be honest about something, because honesty is the only thing I have left to give this story. My father was not a cruel man. He was not complicit in the way people assume when they hear this story secondhand. Nodding along like, of course he knew. How could he not know? He traveled 4 days a week. He came home tired enough that trust felt easier than vigilance. My mother had spent 17 years building a version of herself for him to see, a devoted, competent, endlessly patient mother, and when you build something that carefully, for that long, the people around you stop checking the foundation. That's not an excuse. It's just the truth, and the truth doesn't care whether it's flattering to anyone involved. The specific incident that should have broken the pattern happened in November of that first year, right before my 12th birthday. My grandmother, my mother's own mother, was visiting from Dayton, and at dinner she watched me push my 3 green beans around my plate for 10 minutes without eating a single one. "Carol," she said, "the child's not eating. She had a huge snack after school," my mother said smoothly, not even looking up. "Cheese and crackers, she's just not hungry." My grandmother looked at me. I looked at my plate. I said nothing, because my mother's hand had found my knee under the table, and her fingers had tightened into something that was no longer affectionate. My grandmother let it go, but she watched me for the rest of the visit in a way that made my mother visibly uneasy, finding reasons to keep us in separate rooms, suggesting my grandmother rest upstairs while she and I ran errands, timing every interaction so it never lasted long enough to become a real conversation. On the morning my grandmother left, she pulled me aside in the driveway while my mother was loading a suitcase into the trunk and asked me quietly if everything was all right at home. I said yes. I said it fast, the way you rip off a bandage, because I'd already learned that the truth had a cost I wasn't allowed to pay in front of witnesses. She held my face in both hands for a second, studying me the way grandmothers do, like she was trying to memorize something she suspected she might not get to see again. "You call me if you ever need to," she said. "Anytime, day or night." I never called. I didn't have the words yet, and by the time I might have found them, she was gone. She died 18 months later, of a stroke, in her sleep, never knowing what her silence in that driveway had ultimately cost me, and I've made a kind of peace with that, though it took a long time and a lot of help to get there. I keep her voice from that morning somewhere I can still access it. I think it's part of what kept me alive later, on nights I didn't think I had much left to hold on to. There was a girl at school that year, my best friend since 3rd grade, named Priya Chandran, who noticed things faster than the adults around me ever did. Kids are strange that way. They don't have the luxury of assuming the best about a situation because they haven't yet learned to talk themselves out of what's right in front of them. Priya started saving half her lunch for me around the start of 7th grade, quietly, without making it a production, sliding a folded napkin with crackers or half a sandwich across the cafeteria table like it was nothing. "You just seem hungry," she said once when I asked her why. I didn't correct her. I ate what she gave me in small, careful bites, terrified someone would see, and for a while that napkin was the only reliable meal in my week that didn't come with a number attached to it. My mother found out eventually, the way she found out about most things, and told me I wasn't allowed to sit with Priya at lunch anymore, framing it as a concern about a bad influence, about grades slipping, about needing new friends who were better for me. I lost the one person who might have said something to an adult early enough to matter, and I understand now, with the clarity of looking backward, that losing her wasn't an accident. It was a calculated removal, executed with the same precision my mother applied to everything else. By the winter of my 13th year, my hair had started coming out in the shower, thin dark strands collecting around the drain in amounts that should have alarmed anyone paying attention. I fainted at school in February, in the hallway outside my second period English class, and came to with the school nurse crouched over me and a half-eaten granola bar shoved unceremoniously into my hand. "Has this happened before?" the nurse asked, writing something on a clipboard. "No," I lied, because my mother had drilled the answer into me the way other mothers drill their kids on stranger danger. Lying had become its own kind of survival skill, load-bearing in a different way than the truth would have been. My punishment that night, for the crime of fainting in a public hallway and drawing attention to myself, was watching my family eat a pizza my mother had ordered specifically for the occasion, one that I was not permitted to touch. I sat at the table with a glass of ice water and watched Ren, 10 years old and oblivious, pick pepperoni off her slice and eat around it, the way kids do. My father ate 3 slices and talked about a client account he'd closed that week in Toledo. My mother watched me not eat with an expression I can only describe now as satisfaction, the quiet pride of a job well executed. That was the night, if I'm being honest about the timeline, that I stopped fighting her in any meaningful way. Something in me went quiet and stayed quiet for the better part of a year. The next morning, I looked in the bathroom mirror, the one behind the door where the light was worst, and for the first time, I saw exactly what my mother had spent 2 years describing to me. Not a girl, a problem, a body that needed correcting. "You're right," I told her at breakfast, staring at the rice cake she'd set in front of Ren's empty seat, meant for me. "I'm disgusting. I don't deserve to eat." I watched something shift in my mother's face when I said it, and for one strange, disorienting second, I saw fear there instead of satisfaction. "Maybe just a quarter of an apple," she offered, already cutting one before I'd answered, her hands moving faster than her composure. "No," I said. "You were right, Mom." She didn't push it. I understand now what I couldn't understand then. My mother's control had always required a certain equilibrium. She needed me diminished, but not gone. A daughter who stopped eating entirely wasn't a project anymore. She was a liability, a body that could die and take my mother's carefully built reputation down with it. Lawsuits instead of casseroles from the neighbors, investigations instead of sympathy cards. My mother understood, in whatever calculus she used to justify herself, that my death would cost her more than my hunger ever had. My father noticed that night, the first real crack in 3 years of not noticing. He came home from a 4-day trip to find me pushing an empty plate around the table. No food on it at all, not even the token vegetables my mother usually staged for his benefit. "Where's her plate?" he asked, looking between me and my mother. "Not hungry," I said flatly, and I meant it to sound like nothing, like a phrase a teenager says 100 times a year, but something in my voice must have betrayed the truth underneath it. My mother didn't have a lie ready. I watched her reach for one and come up empty, her mouth opening on nothing for a full 2 seconds before she managed, "She's been picky lately. It's a phase." My father set down his fork. "I haven't seen her eat in 3 days," he said slowly, and I could see him doing the math in real time, running back through the last several dinners, the ones he'd been too tired or too distracted to properly register. "Carol, I haven't seen her eat anything. We need to take her to a doctor," he said, and for one bright, terrifying moment, I let myself believe this was the night it would end. "So now you don't trust me? I'm her mother," my mother snapped, and her voice cracked on the last word in a way that sounded, to anyone who hadn't spent 3 years learning to hear the difference, exactly like genuine hurt. It was a performance so precise it should have won awards. My father, exhausted from 4 days on the road and unwilling to start a fight he didn't have the energy to finish, backed down. Again, the pattern held. 2 days later, I collapsed in the kitchen while he was home, right in front of him, my knees simply giving out the way they'd started to do when I stood up too fast or stayed on my feet too long. He caught me before I hit the tile, and I remember the way his hands shook. "We need a hospital," he said again, firmer this time, and I thought maybe this was it. Maybe this time the crack would hold. But my mother had already recovered her footing, and she talked him back down over the course of a single terrible hour, invoking words like overreacting and dramatic, and you're never even home to see the full picture, and by the time she was done, he'd convinced himself that what he'd witnessed was less alarming than it had looked in the moment. That's the thing about a lie told consistently enough for long enough by someone you love and trust completely. It doesn't just convince the person hearing it, it starts to overwrite what they actually saw with their own eyes. I want to walk you through the specific ways she escalated over those months, because each Each step felt, at the time, like it had to be the ceiling, like surely this was as bad as it could get. And each time, she found a way through. The first escalation came in December, right after the kitchen collapse, when she decided the scale in the morning wasn't giving her enough control over the rest of the day. She started searching my backpack before school, checking for hidden snacks, cash I might use to buy food at the vending machines, anything that represented a loophole in her system. When she found $4 in quarters I'd been saving from babysitting the neighbor's kids, she took it without a word and told me I'd lost vending machine privileges for a month. I responded the way I always did, which was to comply quietly, because compliance had become the only currency I had left that seemed to keep the peace. The second escalation came when she started monitoring what teachers said about me at parent conferences, preemptively. She met with my English teacher, Mrs. Volkov, before the fall conference even happened, told her I'd been struggling with some body image issues we're working through as a family, and asked her to please not make a big deal of it if she noticed anything. It was a masterstroke in its way. She wasn't hiding the problem. She was reframing it, getting ahead of it, turning any adult who might have noticed into an unwitting ally who thought they were respecting a mother's wishes rather than participating in a cover-up. I found out about the conversation months later from Mrs. Volkov herself, in a moment I'll get to. At the time, I only knew that the one teacher who'd started watching me a little too closely suddenly backed off, and I didn't understand why until it was too late to matter. The third escalation involved Ren, and this is the one that still makes my chest tight when I think about it, because it was the moment my mother stopped confining the damage to just me. She discovered sometime in January that Ren had started sneaking me food, half a granola bar during recess, passed hand to hand behind the monkey bars, a slice of cheese folded into a napkin. My mother caught her doing it on a Tuesday and pulled her into the bathroom that night, and I stood outside the door and listened to her tell my 10-year-old sister that if she kept sabotaging me, she'd be the reason I got fatter and sicker, and it would be her fault, entirely her fault, if something happened to me. Ren was 10. She believed her. She stopped passing me food, not because she wanted to, but because my mother had successfully weaponized her love for me against both of us at once. The fourth escalation was the laxatives, though I didn't know that's what they were at the time. I only knew that on the rare occasions my mother allowed me a full meal, usually when my father was watching closely enough that a completely empty plate would have triggered another confrontation, I'd feel violently ill within the hour. I assumed it was my body rejecting food after being deprived of it for so long. I didn't know my mother had enlisted Ren, threatened and frightened enough to comply, to crush the pills into whatever I was given to eat. I found this out on the gym floor, in front of 300 people, and I've had to make peace with the fact that my own sister carried that secret alone for months, an 8-year-old and then a 10-year-old, terrified into silence by a woman who should have been protecting both of us. The fifth escalation, the one that finally became too large to contain, was the plate my mother faked the night my father texted that he was coming home 4 hours earlier than expected from a trip to Columbus. She scrambled, I remember, in a way I'd never seen her scramble before, plating a full dinner in front of my usual seat with shaking hands, and when he walked in and saw food in front of me, he visibly relaxed, some tension leaving his shoulders that I hadn't realized was there. "Good, everyone's eating," he said, and went to wash up, and my mother snatched the plate away the second his back was turned and scraped it directly into the trash. I never touched a bite of it. It existed for exactly 90 seconds, purely for his benefit, a prop in a play he didn't know he was watching. The sixth escalation, and the one that frightened me more than any of the others, came in April, a few weeks before the ceremony, when my mother realized I'd started hiding small amounts of food in my desk drawer at school, saved from the one meal a week she couldn't fully monitor, the Friday pizza day the cafeteria ran as a fundraiser. She found out because Ren, still frightened and still compliant, had mentioned it in passing, not understanding the weight of what she was handing over. My mother didn't yell. She never yelled, which was somehow worse than yelling would have been. She sat me down on the edge of my bed, spoke in the same soft, reasonable voice she used for everything, and told me that if she ever caught me hoarding food again, she'd tell my teachers I'd been stealing from other students' lunches, that she'd make sure the story stuck, that nobody would believe a sick, confused girl over a concerned, attentive mother. I believed her. By then, I had years of evidence that whatever she decided to say, out loud, with enough conviction, simply became true for everyone standing close enough to hear it. She used money as leverage, too, in smaller, quieter ways that took me longer to recognize as part of the same pattern. When my father sent home an extra $50 one month, a bonus from closing a big account in Toledo, meant to be split between us for new school clothes, my mother spent all of it on a dress for herself and told him, when he asked, that she'd used it to buy me a new winter coat I never received. When I asked her about the coat, once, carefully, she looked at me with genuine, wounded surprise and said, "I bought you the blue one. Don't you remember trying it on?" I didn't remember because it hadn't happened, but I nodded anyway, because disagreeing with her version of events had stopped feeling like a real option somewhere around my 12th birthday. That's the part of this I find hardest to explain to people who ask how I let it go on so long. It wasn't that I stopped noticing the lies. It was that noticing them, and being able to do anything about them, had become two entirely separate things. I need to tell you about the detail that mattered later, the one that seemed small at the time and turned out to be the thread that unraveled the whole thing. My mother kept a small spiral notebook in her nightstand drawer, one she thought none of us knew about. I found it once, in March, while looking for a hair tie I'd left in in her room. It was full of numbers in her handwriting, dates and weights, mine and Ren's both, tracked with the kind of obsessive precision you'd expect from someone running a laboratory experiment, rather than raising 2 children. Ren's numbers were sparse, occasional, almost an afterthought. Mine filled page after page, tracked daily for over 2 years with small notes in the margins. Good progress. Regression, cut lunch entirely this week. Reward, half apple. I put the notebook back exactly where I found it and said nothing, but I remembered it existed, and that memory became the single most important thing I owned. Quick pause from the story. If you enjoy these stories, consider taking a listen to our Spotify show linked in the description for early access to new stories in better audio quality. Now back to the video. By April of my 14th year, I weighed 70 pounds, and my school had started requiring a doctor's note for the annual fitness assessment because I could no longer safely participate. My mother forged the note herself on stationery she'd taken from a pediatrician's office years earlier during a visit for something unrelated, claiming I had a heart condition that precluded physical activity. Nobody questioned it. Nobody ever seemed to question anything she put her name to, and I understood, somewhere in the numb middle distance where I existed most days by then, that this was the actual danger of her. Not cruelty alone, competence. She was extremely good at the specific work of making harm invisible. The award ceremony happened in May, on a Thursday night, in the Ashcombe Middle School gymnasium with its bad acoustics and its smell of floor wax and teenage sweat. I've already told you what happened there. The fall, the granola bar, the words I finally said out loud in front of 300 witnesses, after 3 years of saying nothing. I woke up 2 days later in a room at St. Vincent's, tubes running into the back of my hand, my father slumped in a vinyl chair beside the bed with a clipboard clutched in both hands like it might steady him. 73 pounds, he kept saying, to no one, to himself, to the ceiling. My daughter weighs 73 pounds and I ate dinner across from her every single night. The doctor, a woman named Dr. Osei, with a low, even voice that never once wavered no matter what she was saying, laid it out plainly. Mr. Brennan, your daughter has been systematically starved for approximately 3 years. Her heart is showing signs of chronic strain from prolonged malnutrition. Her bone density is consistent with a woman in her 70s. If this had gone on another 48 hours without intervention, we would be having an entirely different conversation. I watched my father's face while she said it. I watched 3 years of small, easy assumptions collapse into something that looked like actual grief, the specific kind that comes from realizing you were present for a catastrophe and mistook it for an ordinary Tuesday. My mother chose that exact moment to make her first real move, standing near the door with a hospital security guard positioned close enough that I understood, even in my drugged and exhausted state, that someone had already flagged her as a risk. He made me do it, she said, steady as anything, her voice carrying that same practiced grief I'd watched her deploy 1,000 times at our dinner table. He's obsessed with having thin daughters. Ask anyone who's known him. I was trying to protect her from something worse. It was, I have to admit even now, a brilliant lie, precision built for its audience. It required no proof, only doubt, and doubt was cheap and easy to manufacture in a room full of exhausted professionals who'd seen every kind of family fall apart and had learned to withhold judgment until the paperwork caught up with the truth. They removed my father from the house that night, pending an investigation neither of us had asked for, and I lay in that hospital bed with wires taped to my chest and understood, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful, that surviving wasn't the finish line I'd thought it was. My mother's story was smooth enough to plant real doubt in trained professionals, and Ren was still too frightened to say a word to anyone but a gymnasium full of strangers in a moment of pure panic. I made myself a promise in that bed, hooked to a monitor that beeped out the rhythm of a heart Dr. Osei said might never fully recover its strength. This wasn't about surviving anymore. Survival was already, barely, accomplished. This was about making sure nobody ever believed her again. The caseworker came the next morning. Her name was Patrice Iwu, and she had the specific, exhausted patience of someone who'd walked into rooms like mine hundreds of times and learned not to promise anything before she'd heard every version of the story. She sat in the chair my father had vacated, opened a thick folder, and asked me gently if I could tell her what had been happening at home. My mother was already there. She'd arrived before Patrice, positioned herself at my bedside, and the moment Patrice asked the question, my mother's hand closed around mine and squeezed hard enough to bruise, hard enough that I understood exactly what the gesture meant, even wrapped in a look of pure maternal devotion for the caseworker's benefit. "Tell her the truth, sweetheart," my mother said, her voice thick with tears that arrived on cue, the way rain arrives on a set when someone flips a switch. "Tell her how sick you've been. Tell her we've been trying so hard to get you help." I opened my mouth to talk about the scale, about the notebook in her nightstand with 2 years of numbers in her own handwriting, about the pediatrician's stationery she'd stolen years before I was even sick enough to need it. My mother talked over me before I could get more than a few words out, launching into a version of events so detailed and so emotionally calibrated that I watched Patrice's pen move faster, writing down every word, and I understood in real time that I was losing the room even as I sat in it. His job kept him away constantly, my mother said, dabbing at eyes that produced tears without ever once losing their sharp focus on Patrice's face. He's always had these ideas about how thin his daughters should be. I tried to manage it quietly, to protect the girls from an actual confrontation, but I couldn't watch it happen anymore and stay silent, so I brought it to a head. I know how that looks. I know I should have said something sooner. I was scared of him. I watched doubt take root behind Patrice's eyes, watched it grow with every sentence my mother spoke, fed by nothing but confidence and volume and the simple, terrible fact that a calm, credible-sounding woman crying real tears is one of the most persuasive things a person can put in front of a stranger. I tried again. That's not. She's the one who. She's confused, my mother said quickly, softly, cutting across me with a gentleness that sounded, to anyone who hadn't lived inside it, like love. The malnutrition affects the brain. The doctor told us that. She's not always clear on what actually happened versus what she's afraid happened. Patrice looked at me, then at my mother, then back at me, and I watched her write something in the folder that I couldn't read from where I was lying, weak and tethered to a bed, fighting a battle I was in no physical condition to win. She believed her. I watched it happen in real time, watched 3 years of documented, deliberate harm get repackaged in 20 minutes into a story about a scared, overwhelmed mother protecting her daughter from an absent, controlling father. There was nothing I could do to stop it from that bed, wired to machines that were still working to convince my own heart to keep a steady rhythm. I want you to sit with that for a second, the way I had to sit with it for weeks afterward, because I think it's the part of this story people skip past too quickly on their way to the ending they already know is coming. Being believed is not automatic. It is not the natural consequence of having survived something. Survival gets you a body in a bed. It does not get you a listener who assumes you're telling the truth. I had to build that piece by piece over the following months, and it nearly didn't happen at all. Before Patrice left the hospital that first day, she crouched down beside my bed so we were closer to eye level and asked me one more question, quiet enough that my mother, arguing with a nurse in the hallway about visiting hours, couldn't hear it. "Is there anything you want to tell me that you didn't get to say in there?" she asked. I looked at her, and I thought about the notebook in the nightstand, and I thought about how tired I was, how the machines beside my bed were doing half the work my own body couldn't manage yet, and I said, "Ask my mother where she keeps her nightstand notebook." Patrice wrote it down without asking a single follow-up question, the way a good investigator does when she recognizes a lead worth protecting. I didn't know in that moment whether it would matter at all. I only knew it was the one true thing I'd managed to get past my mother's voice that day, and I held on to that small victory the way you hold on to anything when you don't have much else left. Patrice's investigation stalled for almost 3 weeks. My father was staying at a Best Western off Route 9, permitted supervised visits only, while my mother remained in the house with Ren and painted herself, to anyone who'd listen, as a woman under siege. She started a private message thread with several of her friends from church, framing herself as the victim of a husband's obsessive control and a daughter's confused, illness-driven accusations. She was, I learned later, extremely convincing. People brought her casseroles. People told her she was so strong. The break came from a place I hadn't expected. Mrs. Volkov, my English teacher, the one my mother had quietly neutralized months before the ceremony, called Patrice's office on her own initiative after hearing what had happened at the award ceremony from another teacher. She told Patrice about the conversation my mother had preemptively initiated back in the fall, the one where she'd asked Mrs. Volkov not to make a big deal out of anything she noticed. Mrs. Volkov had thought nothing of it at the time. In hindsight, laid alongside everything else, it read very differently. It read like a woman building herself an alibi months in advance. Then Ren finally talked. Not at the hospital, where the fear and the noise and my mother's presence had all combined to keep her silent again, after that one desperate outburst in the gym. She talked 3 weeks later, at a follow-up interview Patrice conducted alone, without either parent in the room, in a small office with a box of tissues on the table, and a poster of a cartoon sun on the wall that felt almost cruel in its cheerfulness. Ren was 11 by then. She told Patrice everything. The laxatives crushed into food under threat. The bathroom conversation where my mother told her that any harm to me would be entirely her fault if she kept sabotaging my mother's plan. The years of watching her sister disappear and being too frightened to say a single word to a single adult because the one time she'd tried, at 8 years old, my mother had made it very clear what silence was worth to her and what its absence would cost. I got the notebook to Patrice myself once I was well enough to have a supervised visit at the house under Patrice's direct oversight. I told her exactly where to look, in the nightstand drawer, beneath a stack of old birthday cards. It was still there. My mother, apparently confident enough in her own performance, had never once considered that I might have found it months before, or that I'd remember precisely where it lived. Reading it in Patrice's office, watching her flip through 2 years of my own tracked decline in my mother's careful, looping handwriting, was one of the strangest experiences of my life. There was a page dated the week of my 12th birthday. 62 pounds. Cake tonight, but only a bite in front of Dan. Regression noted. Correct tomorrow. My own mother had documented, in writing, in her own hand, dated and specific, the exact crime she'd stood in a hospital room and blamed on my father. The confrontation happened 6 weeks after the gym floor, in a family court hearing room that smelled like carpet cleaner and old coffee, with a judge named Harold Denny presiding over what was, by that point, an overwhelming body of evidence. My mother sat at a table with her attorney, dressed in a soft blue cardigan that made her look like exactly the kind of woman a jury would want to believe. My father sat across the aisle, thinner himself by then, his face carrying a permanent crease between his eyebrows that hadn't been there before that May. I was called to testify. I was 14 years old and I weighed 81 pounds by then, having gained back some ground in the weeks of supervised, monitored eating that followed my hospital discharge, and I walked to the witness stand with my father's eyes on me and my mother's eyes on me, and I understood that this was the moment, finally, where the truth got to exist in a room without her permission. Reagan, the attorney representing the state, asked me gently, "Can you tell the court what your mornings looked like at home before you were hospitalized?" I told them about the scale behind the towels, about 6:55 every morning, timed precisely to the length of my father's shower, about the whispered numbers and the rationed food and the specific, deliberate cruelty of watching my sister eat a full lunch every day, while I got 3 celery sticks and a rice cake if I'd been good, nothing at all if I hadn't. My mother's composure held for most of it. She'd had 6 weeks to prepare her face for this exact testimony. It cracked, finally and completely, when the state's attorney entered the notebook into evidence and read aloud the entry from my 12th birthday. My mother's own handwriting describing my own starvation as a project with metrics and setbacks and corrections. "That's not what it looks like," my mother said, standing up at her table without being asked to, her voice rising for the first time in front of an audience that wasn't hers to control. "You're taking this completely out of context. I was tracking her nutrition because she had a legitimate health condition, and Mrs. Brennan," Judge Denny said, not unkindly, but with a finality that filled the whole room. "Please sit down. Your attorney will have an opportunity to address this." She sat. I watched something in her face give way completely. The mask she'd worn for 3 years finally sliding off in front of the one audience whose belief she couldn't manufacture anymore. It wasn't triumph I felt watching it happen. I want to be honest about that too. It was something closer to exhaustion, the specific tiredness that comes after holding your breath for years and finally being allowed to let it out. There was a moment near the end of my testimony when the state's attorney asked me directly what I wanted the court to understand, and I said the thing I'd been carrying since the gym floor, the thing that had kept me alive through weeks of hospital food and physical therapy and family court hearing rooms that smelled like carpet cleaner. "I want people to know my dad didn't do this," I said. "He wasn't paying attention, and that's its own kind of failure, and I've had to make peace with being angry about that separately. But he didn't do this to me. She did, and she made sure for 3 years that the one person who could have stopped it never had the chance to see it clearly." Judge Denny asked my mother's attorney, near the end of that session, whether his client had anything further to add before the hearing recessed. My mother stood again, more composed this time, and looked directly at me for the first time since her outburst. "I love my daughters," she said. "Everything I did, I believed I was doing for a reason." Nobody in that room answered her. The silence that followed was its own kind of verdict, heavier than anything Judge Denny could have said aloud, and I watched my mother sit back down into it, finally, fully alone in a way I don't think she'd ever let herself be before. My father cried in the courtroom, not quietly. I'd never seen him cry before that day, not once in 14 years, and something about watching him finally break in a public room after 3 years of being kept carefully, deliberately blind felt like its own kind of vindication, one I hadn't known I needed until I had it. The aftermath took the better part of a year to fully settle, and it never settled cleanly, because these things don't. My mother was charged with felony child endangerment and, eventually, took a plea deal that kept her out of the years-long trial. Neither Ren nor I had the strength to sit through in exchange for a sentence of 6 years, with the possibility of parole after 4. She's currently at the Ohio Reformatory for Women in Marysville. I've received 2 letters from her since the sentencing. I haven't opened either one. My therapist, a woman named Dr. Reyes, who I've seen weekly for over a year now, has told me there's no timeline I owe anyone for that decision, and for the first time in my life, I believed an adult telling me that without needing to check it against a hidden second meaning. The family fractured along lines I couldn't have predicted going into the hearings. My Aunt Denise, the same aunt whose garlic bread had apparently offended my mother back when I was 9, became one of my most consistent allies through the whole process, driving 4 hours from Dayton every other weekend to sit with Ren and me while our father worked through the custody arrangements. My mother's church friends, the ones who'd brought casseroles during her 3 weeks of performed victimhood, mostly disappeared once the notebook became public record, though a few sent me letters afterward, apologizing for believing her so completely, so quickly, without asking a single hard question. I've kept those letters. Not because I've forgiven the people who wrote them, exactly, but because I think it matters to remember how easily good intentions can be weaponized by someone patient enough to aim them correctly. My father lost his job during the worst of it, not directly because of the case, but because the months of custody hearings and supervised visits and therapy appointments made his old travel schedule impossible, and his company wasn't interested in accommodating a father going through what he was going through. He found work eventually, closer to home, a smaller territory with a smaller paycheck, and he's told me more than once that he'd take the pay cut every year for the rest of his life if it meant being home enough to actually see his daughters. I believe him. I've watched him prove it, dinner after dinner, in ways that used to feel unbearably tender before they started to feel, slowly, like something closer to normal. There was a moment, weeks after the sentencing, when Ren asked to see the notebook, the one entered into evidence, the one that had finally tipped the whole case in our favor. I didn't want her to. I remembered too clearly what it felt like reading my own decline tracked in someone else's careful handwriting. demanding, and I didn't want that specific weight added to a childhood that had already been asked to carry so much. She insisted, gently but firmly, in the way she'd started insisting on things since the trial ended, like she'd decided somewhere along the way that she was done being managed by anyone, including me. We read it together at the kitchen table, page by page, and when we got to the entry from my 12th birthday, she reached over and took my hand without saying anything at all. That was the whole conversation. It was enough. Ren struggled the hardest, I think, in ways that took longer to surface. She carried a guilt that wasn't hers to carry, convinced for months that her silence had cost me something irreplaceable, that her small, terrified compliance with my mother's threats made her complicit in what happened to me. It took a long time and a good child therapist, and a lot of very direct conversations at our kitchen table before she started to understand that an 8-year-old threatened by her own mother doesn't owe anyone a debt for surviving that the only way she knew how. I told her once, in the middle of one of those conversations, that I never once blamed her, not on the gym floor, and not since. And I watched something in her finally loosen when she heard it, like a held breath she hadn't realized she was still holding 2 years later. Denise ended up moving to Ashcombe permanently about a year after the sentencing, taking a job at a credit union 20 minutes from our new house so she could be close enough to help without hovering. She started a Sunday tradition with Ren and me, a standing brunch at a diner on Route 9 called the Whistle Stop, where the only rule was that everyone ordered whatever they wanted and nobody commented on anyone else's plate. It sounds like such a small thing to build a tradition around. For the two of us, it wasn't small at all. It was the first place either of us learned that a meal could just be a meal, with no ledger attached to it, no number waiting on the other side. There was a specific evening, about 8 months after the hearing, that I still think about more than almost anything else from that year. My father made dinner, a full one, and set plates in front of both of us, and Ren and I ate every bite in front of him without either of us performing anything for anyone. He watched us eat, openly, without pretending not to, the way I understand now he should have been watching all along, and about halfway through the meal he set down his fork and just sat there for a moment, looking at both of us. "I'm sorry," he said. "I know I've said it before. I need you both to know I'll keep saying it as many times as it takes." I didn't tell him it was fine. It wasn't fine, not entirely, and I've learned that pretending otherwise doesn't actually help anyone heal faster. But I told him I was glad he was finally, actually there, and I meant it, and I watched something ease in his shoulders that had been tight for the better part of a year. I grieved something during that stretch of months that I hadn't expected to grieve. Not my mother exactly, though there were nights I cried for the version of her I'd wanted to believe was real, the one who braided my hair before school when I was small and sang along badly to the radio in the car. I grieved the childhood I should have had, the one where a scale was just a scale and not a weapon, where dinner was just dinner and not a performance staged for an audience of one exhausted man. I grieved the sister I should have gotten to be for Ren, present and steady, instead of the cautionary example she watched disappear for 3 years while she was too young and too frightened to help. Some of what was taken from all three of us can't be returned. I've stopped waiting for a version of justice that gives that back, because it doesn't exist, and waiting for it only kept me tethered to the worst years of my life longer than I needed to be. There were legal complications that dragged on far past the actual sentencing. My mother's parental rights weren't formally terminated until almost a year later, a process that required its own hearings, its own paperwork, its own slow-grinding bureaucratic churn that felt, at times, like its own form of punishment for a crime I hadn't committed. There were medical bills, thousands of dollars my father absorbed without complaint, physical therapy and cardiac monitoring, and the specialized nutritional counseling that helped rebuild what 3 years had worn away. There was a life insurance policy my mother had taken out on both Ren and me 2 years into the abuse, a detail the investigators found deeply troubling, and I've chosen, mostly, not to think about too closely, because some implications are heavier than I have the capacity to carry most days. The house itself became its own small battle. My father wanted to sell it immediately, unable to walk past the kitchen without seeing the hidden scale behind the towels, but the sale dragged on for months because my mother's name remained on the deed until her parental rights and the related civil proceedings were fully resolved. We lived in a rented duplex for almost a year while the paperwork crawled through the system, 3 of us in 2 bedrooms, which should have felt like a step backward, and somehow felt like the opposite. Nobody in that duplex was hiding anything from anyone else. It was cramped and imperfect, and it was the safest place I'd ever slept. I'm 16 now. I weigh 118 pounds, which Dr. Osei tells me is healthy for my height and frame, and I no longer flinch at the number the way I used to flinch at every number that ever got attached to my body. I still see Dr. Reyes weekly. Some weeks are harder than others. There are mornings I still wake up, and for one disoriented second before I'm fully conscious, brace for a scale that isn't there anymore, a whispered number nobody is going to say to me again. My father and Ren and I live in a smaller house now on the other side of Ashcombe, close enough to my old school that I sometimes drive past the gymnasium and feel almost nothing at all, which surprises me more than feeling something would. My father cooks most nights now, badly, cheerfully, and we eat together at a table where nobody's plate is a secret from anybody else's. Ren is 13 and loud and funny in a way I think she's only recently felt safe enough to be, and some evenings I catch my father watching both of us eat with an expression I've come to understand as a kind of penance he's still working through, quietly, one dinner at a time. I think about about that gymnasium sometimes. The green dress and the tilting floor and the 300 strangers who became, without meaning to, the first people who ever truly saw what my mother had spent 3 years hiding in plain sight. I used to think the lesson of my own story was about survival, about the sheer stubborn will it takes to hold on through something designed to erase you slowly enough that nobody notices until it's almost too late. I don't think that anymore. I think the real lesson is quieter and harder than survival, and it's this. My father sat across from me at dinner every single night for 3 years and never once noticed that my plate was completely empty. And the hardest, truest thing I've had to learn is that his blindness and my mother's cruelty were not the same crime, even though they left the same wreckage behind. He failed me by not looking closely enough. She failed me by making absolutely certain there was nothing safe to see. I've made room, slowly, for both of those truths to exist without canceling each other out, because that's the only way I've found to actually move forward instead of just standing very still in the wreckage, waiting for an apology big enough to cover everything that was lost. Some things were lost that no verdict, no notebook, no courtroom testimony can give back. I don't have a mother anymore, not really, not one I can trust, and there are nights that specific absence still aches in a way I don't think will ever fully close over. I've stopped expecting that ache to disappear entirely. Dr. Reyes told me once that grief for a person who's still alive is its own particular weight, different from mourning someone you've lost to death, because there's no funeral, no clean edge, just an ongoing absence you have to keep choosing not to fill with false hope. She was right. Some Sundays, watching Ren laugh at something Denise said over pancakes at the whistle stop, I feel it anyway, underneath the good parts, quiet and persistent, and I've learned to let it sit there instead of fighting it. But I have a father who finally looks at my plate now, every single night, and asks before I've even finished chewing whether I want more, not because he's performing vigilance for anyone watching, but because watching has simply become who he is now. I have a sister who no longer has to carry a secret alone in the dark, who tells me things now, small things, without flinching first to check whether it's safe. Most days, that's enough to build a life around. Not a perfect one, just a real one, finally, with nothing hidden behind the towels in the closet anymore, and nobody left in the house who needs it to stay that way.